Hello, welcome. I'm Susie. This is my podcast. Today, I'm thinking about women. I think about women all the time, not necessarily, sexually, although sometimes, sure, but more, within the greater context of what does it mean to be a woman? What is the role of women in the world? How does it exist is in a distinct way? Does it exist in a distinct way? What do we agree upon? What do we disagree upon? How has it changed? Ideas of being a woman. It's juicy. It's sexy stuff. I mean, we can't deny it. There's a lot of, discussion around gender in our world right now and what it represents and particularly within the lens of people's rights and how they exist in the world as their authentic selves. Gender is seated very centrally to a lot of those conversations. And I find it really interesting that a lot of our discussion about women still seems mostly filtered through a patriarchal sieve, a lens of, male dominated kind of heteronormative thinking. And I don't say that, necessarily as a critique, although, it is, but I think it's a natural reaction and one that's very difficult, to break away from because it is so deeply rooted in our history. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So stick around. One of the most interesting things to me about any discussion of women through society, like contemporary conversations about women, again, it tends to be that we think about the idea of women still, kind of as other to men or women or non binary individuals as contrary to or juxtaposed to men or heteronormative, masculine ideas. I think there's a good reason for that. But one of the things that I think is most distinct is this idea of binary opposites, right? The concept of, men as, noble and strong and women as sacred and sinful. The ideas of women as, either the Madonna or the whore, right? These are all present in our culture from way, 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 way back. And they diverge in different places. It's one of the things I kind of want to talk about is the history of women. I think some common themes exist through history relative to a woman's role as caregiver and all of the, kind of personality attributes or characteristics that we imbue that role with, like being nurturing, being a little, being submissive to, kind of the strength or the protector role. Those are embedded in us, in many of us, as being sort of central to womanhood. And I think that there's a lot of reason to challenge that. I think there's a lot of examples throughout history that sort of demonstrate that those dichotomies are not necessarily inborn, that they're created. I think that's a really interesting idea and one worth exploring, one worth embracing. The problem with gender studies, the problem with women's studies is that for a large segment of the audience, it just feels like, women sort of shrilly screeing about how, they're just not happy with their lot in life. And so I want to just kind of come out and say right now that I want no truck with any of that because I think that a critical understanding of your place in the world is a worthwhile endeavor, regardless of where you are in the world. I think we should just kind of take that as a given. That's my thinking. So, fair warning as we progress. I'm gonna get pedantic, y'all. I'm gonna break it down into some pretty dry bones stuff here. But I think that even the driest conversation about the juiciest subjects, women, sex, these are hard to make boring. So I shall endeavor to strike the balance of not being boring talking about sex. Good luck to me. So let's begin with a just brief overview of the role of women in history, and it's particularly with some focus on common characteristics, but also disparate examples where those paradigms, those role models were subverted in some way. So I like to start with Egypt because I think Egypt being like the first documented civilization that we have, Egypt is an excellent example of sort of a cradle of civilization, type of place. So one thing to note about Egyptian culture, the primary god initially was matriarchal. She was Isis. Actually, it was a brother and sister team, Isis and Osiris, the wonder twin powers of Egyptian deities. Isis really held all the cards and knew how to play them and was creator, destroyer, she was all the things. There were actually 15 women pharaohs throughout Egyptian history, throughout the various dynasties. I mean, we're covering many thousands of years here. So proportionately, it's, like still kind of small, but it does demonstrate that the Egyptians had a different conception of rulers in general and women as rulers. They were much more legitimized to the extent that their deities, already imbued them with sacred power. And so when you had a ruler selected by those deities, chosen by divinity, there's really no reason to question. A good example of that is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut ruled around the 1500 BCE. She had about a 20-year rule, which, for the time was significant. She came to power through a regency, not uncommon for women. So, she was the wife of a king, mother of a king. The king died, and the heir was too young, and so Hatshepsut, took on that regency and ruled for a long, long time, and quite successfully. She pioneered in trade. She pioneered in building. Some of the most significant monuments in Egypt were commissioned by Hatshepsut and were built to honor her greatness and document her power. Also dynastic expansion. She, sort of had military exploits where she moved into neighboring regions and expanded the geographical reach of Egypt and really kind of established the wealth of the 18th dynasty. But interestingly, Hatshepsut in her images, which was, really the propaganda of the day. The people weren't really, reading and writing obviously was not a common gift. It wasn't something that most people did. It was really sort of exclusive to the religious and the noble class. And Hatshepsut's images, oftentimes she does portray herself in sort of the regalia of the king, which is, including the false beard and the appropriate crown. And this is the image that, is pushed forth into the populace to sort of reinforce her power and her rule, that she imbues both the male and the female qualities. And it's interesting to note that the images of Hatshepsut were not exclusively in that male regalia. There's a lot of imagery of her fully in, her feminine manifestation. So it wasn't really designated as like she's like a man and therefore, powerful. It was her divinity, her, right to rule imbued her with this sort of balanced existence that like perfectly harmonized both characteristics. So that's just like an interesting, now the Greeks who existed, sort of coterminously, the Egyptians in the latter portion of the Egyptian dynasties, the Greeks had pantheistic traditions, meaning they had multiple gods, and those gods were both male and female. And those male and female deities, in many respects, it was indifferent to their sex, right? That they were gods and goddesses by virtue of, where they existed in the pantheon and what they represented and the different characteristics or houses or, not houses, but, categories or areas of specialty, etc. But the pantheon had a king, and that king was Zeus. And Zeus acquired his crown through the masculine efforts of, rebellion and, violent overthrow. So that, there's clearly in the Greeks a distinction in the male and female counterparts, the even in the deities. And that is expressed in a lot of the myths as well. One of my favorite Greek myths is the myth of Pandora. And Pandora was created by Hephaestus, who was the god of, he was like the forge of the god, like the smith of the gods. So what happened was Prometheus, who sympathized with humans, the humans were kind of in this situation where like they could get all the scraps, like the meat, and the juicy stuff of the sacrifices, like the gods got all of that, and the people really just kind of got gristle and leftover bone and stuff, and that was just like the way it be until Prometheus took pity upon humans and stole fire from Olympus and gifted it to men. And then men had the power of the gods at their fingertips. They could prepare their own food, and gave them, new weapons of war, and ability to forge, and fire just opened up a whole new dimension for for humans. And Zeus was pretty mad about it because he liked his power. He was the king. King wants to share their crown. So his punishment to Prometheus was to send him to the underworld, and there's a bird that pecks out his liver every day, and then it grows back overnight, and it's pretty horrible. But before all that, Prometheus was Hephaestus, who was tasked by Zeus to cobble together a clay avatar, a woman, and that woman was then imbued with all of these different characteristics and gifts from the gods. The women of those gods, the goddesses, imbued Pandora with all of the characteristics known to women, secrecy and deception and sinfulness and lust. And they packaged her all up and they made her look really pretty. And then they gave her a jar, and in the jar, um, they put in all of the evil in the world and all the disease and darkness and horror in the world. And then they threw some hope in there because I guess they just needed something to balance, a little soupçon to balance it out. And they gave her the jar and they said, never, never open this jar, Pandora. And she went, okay. And she went out into the world, and chaos swirled around her, and all the evil was, introduced into the world, because she couldn't help herself. She opened up that jar, and out it all came. It's a sad story. And it also is very, it echoes Eve in later, or rather, I guess Eve echoes Pandora in later Christian mythology, but again kind of gives you an idea of the things that women represented. And women represented the downfall of men in most respects, that men were held to have the higher virtues of humanity, and that women kind of corrupted that in some respects. In Asia, China had no truck with women in their pants. That was not a thing. Women were just plain, submissive throughout pretty much all Eastern Asian cultures. India, interestingly, is a counterpoint to that, because again, a pantheistic tradition and also a caste-based tradition. So they were a little more worried about class than they were about gender. Their pantheon demonstrates a lot of gender parity between the gods and goddesses. No one of them is sort of greater than another. They all seem to exist in pairs. So there's a more balanced portrayal of human expression in Indian pantheistic traditions. And then, of course, Judeo Christian periods have a lot to say about women. Most of it is not great. Again, echoing Pandora, the idea of woman as sinful, as the origin of sin, the downfall of men, Madonna whore. Islam similarly is not very little space for women in its traditions. They really are relegated to caregiver spaces. Not they're not held as sacred in the same way that women are sometimes held as sacred in Christianity, but they also seem to completely sort of make subversive the role of women in isolation as caregiver and as a tool of men. So religion as a whole, right, which is central to our history as human beings for lots and lots and lots of reasons, none of which I will explore today. You see this very broad and expansive tradition of putting people in their defined places within a societal framework. And yet there's almost always exceptions to those rules. There's almost always transgression to those ideas. And almost always those transgressions are put down and punished, and until they find a solidarity, until they find a voice. The history of the LGBTQ plus spectrum has been with us. It's forever. Like, there's just lots and lots of forensic evidence that demonstrates that gender fluidity is present in humanity in all its manifestations. That sexuality exists on a spectrum for any single person. That, like, a purely hetero situation is really, it's kind of fanciful when you look at it from a just a pure human behavior point of view, without the deference to the social structures within that person exists in. I'm not going to talk a ton about, LGBTQ history nor its expression or experiences, because, for quite honestly, I don't have those. I don't have those experiences. I don't share those experiences. I will say, in general, that all of those experiences are valid and should be heard and should be expressed. And I think that I would encourage each and every person hearing this to go out and seek out those content creators, seek out other perspectives, seek out people who represent, different life experiences, to try to get an understanding of how those experiences manifest themselves in the world and what their intersections are with your life in some ways. It's a good exercise. One of the ways in which we contemplate the idea of women and gender is through the exercise and the thinking of feminism. Now, unfortunately, the word feminism carries with it a lot of baggage, a lot of social understanding and context. And so, depending on who you are and, you know, what your place in the world is, your understanding of that word is going to differ from another person's and perhaps mine. For the sake of argument, I'm going to sort of posit that the idea of feminism is very simply the idea that women exist as equal human beings, and that all of the thinking and the talking and the resistance, kind of under that feminist banner, is really an effort to achieve the equality of human status, and not any other meaningful exercise that intends to dominate men or oppress men or turn the tables on men, or none of that. Just challenging sort of the establishment thinking about women's roles in society. Like, that's kind of the basic tenet of feminism. And one of the pioneer thinkers of feminism, one of the pioneer thinkers, just period, the end, is a lovely lady named Simone de Beauvoir, who existed in the 20th century, sort of mid 20th century. She was a partner to Jean-Paul Sartre, who the known existentialist philosopher, and was really a powerful and really accomplished thinker and theorist in her own right, of course, although not fully recognized until sort of later down the road. So, just briefly, I want to talk a little bit about the ideas of epistemology and phenomenology, because those are the sort of two pillars upon which this thinking of, de Beauvoir's really exists. Now, that those are words that I'm sure a lot of people are like eye rolling and kind of like, get over it, Dr. Wizard or whatever. But it's important to sort of establish that this concept of these two areas of thinking are important to understand why de Beauvoir presents the ideas that she does. So, the first of which is something I've talked about before, which is epistemology. Epistemology being the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know in the world? How does our knowledge become formulated? How is our knowledge imposed upon the world? How is the world affected by our understanding of it? Lots of just interesting, complex questions about why, how our experiences of the world translate into knowledge and ideas. And then, secondarily, the idea of phenomenology, which is the practice and study of experience and consciousness, as a subject, and that analysis of those experiences in the world, kind of tells us something about our experiences in the world, insofar as they are representative of our intentionality, a representation of our manifestations, of our experiences of ourselves in the world and the experiences of others in the world, right? So it gets muddy, but these are ideas that we all kind of have, like on a basic level. I mean, if you break it down into like, right, relationship troubles, right? Like you're having a relationship, an argument with your partner, and you just really kind of want to know, like, what is going on in their head? Like they're mad, you don't understand why you're mad, and maybe you don't understand that, why either, and you got to unpack, a lot of what's going on there. Those kinds of explorations are epistemological and phenomenological in nature. Why am I thinking this? Like, what is drawing me to these conclusions, and is it real? Is it reasonable? Is it rational? Is it, informed by my emotions? And if so, what are those emotions and what's driving those, and past experiences, and blah 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 blah. Human beings are messy and complicated. Spoiler alert. Simone de Beauvoir and her contemporaries, kind of, well, she really didn't have a lot of contemporaries in this area, but so let me just say, people who picked up her thinking and carried it forward. So her disciples, I guess, apostates, I don't know. Feminist theorists, let's put it that way. One of the things that they argue against is this idea of biological determinism. And the idea of biological determinism is essentially that the sex and gender distinctions, those classifications, kind of drive characteristics and behavior. Again, going back to the ideas that Christianity or other religions or other historical cultures have imbued the idea of gender with, right? That women are softer, they're nurturing, they're caregivers, they're more emotional, less rational, they're weaker physically, right? All of these different things, these attributes that we kind of imbue in the idea of woman, and yet we know them not to be true on sort of a, granularly, individualized basis. Like that can't the all of those sort of gender characteristics can't be attributed to every single person who's either, born with female reproductive organs, or, who perhaps is not and yet identifies as a woman. So it does it make them less of a woman? And biological determinism would argue that it sure as heck does. And I think we'd have to challenge that. One of the challenges that I intend to dive into and sort of push on is the idea of gender as a construct. De Beauvoir has a lot to say about this, and I will have a lot to say about it in another context later. I want to sort of break down Simone's thinking about it. Much of her work on this is set forth in her book called The Second Sex. It's a masterpiece. If you have the time and the inclination, I encourage you to check it out. It's really, really interesting, and is a beautiful precursor to a lot of feminist thinking. Here, I'm going to quote something actually from the Stanford Philosophy Encyclopedia, which is freaking awesome, you guys. Like, I just don't have enough good things to say about it. If you're into philosophy and if you have philosophical questions or a question about a philosophical thinker, that should be your first stop. It's really just a well done website. Hat tip to Stanford. So this is from their webpage, that the sex speaks to the specific ways that the natural and social sciences and the European literary, social, political, and religious traditions have created a world where impossible and conflicting ideals of femininity produce an ideology of women's, quote, natural inferiority to justify patriarchal domination, end quote. And I think that really beautifully, and succinctly encapsulates the argument that's being set forth here, which is often quoted as her, kind of most famous quote, which is, "One is not born, but becomes a woman." That society tells women where they belong and how to behave. And that what society tells women to be is dictated largely by the power in that society, which is undisputably men, and white men in particular. So again, we got to come back to this idea of all of these feminine characteristics, right? The first of which I'm going to talk about is the idea that the women are the weaker sex. Now, I'd like to just say for the record that, of course, I understand that our thinking today has evolved past these places. Most of you listening think much of the idea of patriarchal domination is, poppycock, right? It's clearly old thinking, and, good for you. But unconscious bias is a thing that exists. We all have it. It's unconscious. And the unconscious bias is created in large part through our societal understandings, which are not spoken to us as, axiomatic. They're not given to us like Moses carving commandments, onto a tablet. They're spoken to us subliminally and unconsciously through advertising, our media, our books, our newspapers, our politicians, our parents, our religious leaders, our neighbors, our friends. The ideas that we carry with us, influenced by all sorts of different forces, culminate into a classification of social mores that we sort of police one another with. And that's a challenging thing to push back against because it's not a centralized power structure, that you can resist. It's a way of thinking. And that's a really hard thing to get at. So again, women as the weaker sex, insofar as women are less physically strong than men, right? Maybe, but then it sort of begs the question of like, what do you mean by strength then, right? Like, obviously, you can talk about like inner strength or like your spiritual resilience or like whatever, but that's not even what I'm talking about. Like different different qualities of physical strength. Like I've had two babies, y'all. Like and in the modern age, I'm able to be medicated and sort of anesthetized to the point that like it didn't cause me physical distress. But these are new developments in human history. And women have been having babies through human history. You got to push out like a watermelon sized alien parasite through a hole that is about the size of a kiwi. I mean, that requires some degree of strength. I mean, so does that not count as strength? Is that not a genuine manifestation of strength? Is it just, do you even lift, bro? So, questions, I think, and again, phenomenologically challenging our assumptions about those kinds of things, right? Exercising our will to identify our assumptions and question why we've come to them, where were they formulated, and at whose hand, right? Who does it benefit? Who does it harm? The otherness of women is again sort of defined within this comparative framework, and it assumes the primacy of men, as I discussed in a previous episode. The idea of medicine and medical standards and practices are formulated from what's the normal male anatomy. And again, that's not to presume that there's anything significantly anatomically different between men and women, right? We have all the same organs, except for reproductively, but even the reproductively, they're more or less in the same places. There's common, anatomical frameworks that makes humans humans. And yet there are differences, there are distinctions, there are, kind of specific physiological distinctions that service the reproductive capabilities and other. We don't entirely know what all those things are because, we just don't know everything. Sorry to break it to you. But that otherness, right, that primacy of men has really kind of put women in a position of having to make some choices about, you either choose your submissive role and be what society expects you to be, or you have to succeed by other means. And throughout history, a lot of those other means have looked like looking like a man, acting like a man. Again, Hatshepsut, Elizabeth the First, carried some qualities of this. I'll speak to that. Joan of Arc, another one, had to dress up like a man to, get into the French military and appeal to the king. Later punished for it horrifically, I might add. Simone de Beauvoir says that social discrimination produces in women moral and intellectual effects so profound they appear to be caused by nature. And I think that that is a really acute and profound statement that sort of speaks to how our culture polices our own understanding of who we are in the world and how that should look. It's a sublimation of the self within a power dynamic so complete that the subject themselves may not even be aware of it. And that's happening to us all the time, and the resistance to it can often feel scary. It's one of the reasons why these conversations continuously haunt us. And it's one of the reasons we'll continue to talk about it. Okay, so as with the previous series on rights. I'm going to break this one down. I had originally thought it might be two. I think it might be three. We'll find out. It might be two. I don't know. There's a lot to say. There's so much to say. In the next episode, though, I will be talking about sort of common themes of women throughout history, beginning in the Elizabethan era, and how some of those concepts carried forward into our current day understanding of women's roles in society. We're going to dive a little bit into the ideas of sex and morals, and we're going to talk a lot more about gender as construct. So I hope you will join me again. Thank you so much for being with me. I really appreciate you coming back. And if you like it, I hope that you'll share it. If there's somebody out there you think might like to share, participate in some of these ideas, I hope that you'll let them know, share, spread the word. And I have developed an email account and an IG account. So I'd love to hear back from people. I'd love to hear some feedback on the ideas. And I'd love to hear, critical arguments. Keep it cool, right? Keep it classy. But I'd love to hear challenging arguments, some of the things that I've said, and I'll figure out a way, hopefully, to explore those in later episodes. So, without further ado, you can reach me by email at Susie Makes a Podcast. That's SUZI Makes a Podcast at gmail.com. And you can reach me on Instagram at Susie Makes a Podcast. Again, that's SUZI Makes a Podcast. So yeah, I really hope that you'll engage a little bit because I love to hear the different perspectives that people have. Mine is only one. It's a tiny lens. I'm an insignificant creature in a wide, wide world, and so are you. But together we make magic. So I want to hear it. I hope you'll reach out. Until next time.